On November 25, 1899, just 2 days after the brutal fighting at Belmont, Lord Methuen's exhausted British column approached another line of rocky kopjes, blocking the road to Kimberley. The position was called Graspan, named for a nearby farm, and intelligence suggested it was held by perhaps 1,000 Boers who would likely withdraw without serious resistance after their defeat at Belmont. Within hours, that intelligence would prove catastrophically wrong. The kopjes at Graspan concealed over 2,500 Boer fighters who had no intention of withdrawing, who had spent the night preparing positions with meticulous care, and who were determined to prove that Belmont had been no fluke. What followed was 4 hours of savage close-quarters fighting that produced the highest casualty rate per hour of any engagement in the early war, fighting so intense that British soldiers reached Boer trenches and fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and rifle butts, combat so brutal that even hardened veterans would describe it as the most vicious they had ever experienced. By day's end, the British would capture Graspan at a cost of nearly 200 casualties in a single morning's work. And Lord Methuen would realize with growing dread that the road to Kimberley was turning into a killing ground that might destroy his entire force before he reached the besieged city. This is the story of the bloodiest hill fight of the Boer War's opening phase, where 2 armies collided in savage violence that left both sides stunned by the intensity and cost of modern warfare. To understand why Graspan became such a bloodbath, we must examine the tactical and psychological situation of both armies just 48 hours after Belmont. Lord Methuen's relief column had captured its objective at Belmont, but at a cost that shocked British commanders accustomed to minimal casualties in colonial warfare. Over 300 men had fallen, taking what was supposed to be a minor position. The troops were exhausted, having fought a 12-hour battle and then marched onward with minimal rest. Morale was shaken by the discovery that Boer farmers could shoot with terrifying accuracy, and that kopjes, which appeared insignificant from a distance, became deadly fortresses when approached. But Methuen had no choice except to continue. Kimberley remained under siege. The political pressure for its relief was enormous, and the only route was through continued Boer defensive positions. Methuen's column numbered over 7,000 men, still a formidable force, but the casualties at Belmont had started to erode his numerical advantage. More concerning was the psychological impact. His soldiers now understood that every kopje might be another Belmont, every advance another costly assault under fire from enemies they could barely see. The Boer forces at Graspan were commanded by General Koos de la Rey, who would emerge as one of the most capable commanders of the entire war. De la Rey was 42 years old, a farmer and veteran of earlier conflicts, who possessed an intuitive grasp of tactics and an ability to inspire his men. Unlike some Boer commanders who were content with defensive fighting, de la Rey understood the importance of taking the initiative when circumstances allowed. At Graspan, he had prepared not just to resist British attack, but to inflict maximum casualties and potentially destroy Methuen's advance entirely. The terrain at Graspan consisted of several kopjes forming a rough line across the British line of advance, with the most significant positions being a series of rocky ridges that dominated the surrounding veldt. What made Graspan more formidable than Belmont was the configuration of these positions. They formed interlocking fields of fire that meant British troops attacking one position would come under fire from adjacent kopjes. De la Rey had used the night of November 24th to strengthen these positions, building stone, sungars, clearing fields of fire, and positioning his commandos to maximize their defensive advantages. Critically, de la Rey had also concentrated significantly more force at Graspan than the British anticipated. Intelligence had suggested perhaps 1,000 Boers. The actual number was over 2,500, nearly triple the estimate. This intelligence failure would prove costly, as British tactical plans were based on attacking a much smaller force. When Methuen's troops discovered they were facing far more defenders than expected, they were already committed to the assault and could not easily disengage. The British approach to Graspan began in the pre-dawn darkness of November 25th. Following the same tactical pattern as Belmont, a night march to get troops close to the Boer positions, followed by an assault at first light supported by artillery. But the troops conducting this approach were no longer fresh soldiers, confident in easy victory. They were exhausted men who had buried friends at Belmont 2 days earlier and who now faced another line of kopjes that looked ominously similar to the ones that had cost so much blood. As dawn broke over Graspan, British forces found themselves in a worse tactical position than they had been at Belmont. The night march had not brought them as close to the Boer positions as planned, meaning they would have to advance across even more open ground under fire. The terrain approaching the kopjes was more broken and difficult than aerial reconnaissance had suggested, offering some cover but also channelizing the British advance into predictable routes that the Boers could target. And most critically, the kopjes themselves were occupied by a far larger and more determined force than intelligence had indicated. The Boers opened fire at first light, and the British immediately knew this would be worse than Belmont. The volume of fire was intense, suggesting far more defenders than expected. The accuracy was as devastating as before, with men falling across the entire British front. And, unlike Belmont, where some Boer positions had run low on ammunition and withdrawn, at Graspan the defenders maintained heavy, sustained fire that showed no signs of slackening. British artillery opened a bombardment of the Boer positions, naval guns and field artillery pounding the kopjes with high explosive and shrapnel. The noise was tremendous, the smoke and dust obscuring much of the battlefield. But as at Belmont, the artillery's effectiveness against dispersed defenders in stone sungers was limited. Shells exploded dramatically against rocky hillsides, but the Boer riflemen in their carefully constructed positions were largely protected. They simply waited out the bombardment and resumed firing when it lifted. The assault on Graspan was spearheaded by the 9th Lancers and the Northumberland Fusiliers, supported by other infantry regiments. The plan called for a coordinated advance across the front, with different units attacking different sections of the Boer line simultaneously to prevent the defenders from concentrating their fire. In theory, this was sound tactics. In practice, the coordination broke down almost immediately under the intensity of Boer fire and the difficulty of the terrain. The Northumberland Fusiliers advanced toward the central kopje in extended order, moving as quickly as the broken ground allowed. Officers led from the front, as Victorian military culture demanded, and were shot down in disproportionate numbers. The regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Crabbe, was killed early in the assault, his death removing cohesive leadership at a critical moment. Other officers fell trying to take his place, creating a cascading command crisis as the assault was only beginning. What made Graspan different from Belmont was the intensity and proximity of the fighting. At Belmont, much of the combat had been at longer ranges, with British troops pinned down by fire before they could reach the Boer positions. At Graspan, British units actually closed with the Boer trenches, leading to savage hand-to-hand combat of a type that was supposed to be extinct in modern warfare. Soldiers who reached the rocky slopes of the kopjes found themselves fighting at ranges of yards rather than hundreds of yards, shooting into sungers from close range and in some cases physically grappling with defenders. The fighting around the Boer trenches was absolutely brutal. British soldiers, having crossed hundreds of yards of open ground under fire and climbed steep rocky slopes while being shot at, reached the Boer positions with a fury born of fear and exhaustion. They shot Boer defenders at point-blank range, used bayonets in desperate struggles, and in some cases fought with rifle butts and bare hands. The Boers, fighting from their prepared positions but now under direct assault, resisted with equal ferocity. Men shot each other from distances where they could see each other's faces. Trenches became slaughterhouses, where the advantage shifted second by second as new combatants poured in. This kind of close-quarters combat was extraordinarily rare in the Boer War, where most fighting occurred at longer ranges between opponents who barely saw each other. At Graspan, for perhaps 20 or 30 terrifying minutes, portions of the battlefield descended into primal violence that more closely resembled medieval warfare than the supposed modernity of 1899. Survivors from both sides would describe these moments with a mixture of horror and awe, struggling to articulate the psychological impact of killing and nearly being killed at arm's length. The critical moment came when British forces managed to capture several key positions on the main kopje, breaking the defensive line and threatening to envelop the Boer flanks. De la Rey, observing the battle from his command position, recognized that his line was breaking and that continuing to hold risked the destruction of his entire force. With the same tactical flexibility that characterized successful Boer commanders throughout the war, he ordered a fighting withdrawal. The commandos would abandon their positions but maintain organization, conducting a tactical retreat rather than a rout. The Boer withdrawal from Graspan was conducted under fire, with rearguards holding positions to cover the movement of the main body. British forces, exhausted from the assault and disorganized by casualties and the intensity of the fighting, pursued only half-heartedly. Methuen's troops occupied the kopjes by late morning, giving them technical victory, but the condition of his force made immediate pursuit impossible. Men who had been fighting for hours needed rest, the wounded required evacuation, and unit cohesion had to be restored. The casualty count from Graspan shocked both sides. British losses totaled nearly 200 in just 4 hours of fighting. 57 killed outright, over 120 wounded, and several missing. For 4 hours of combat. This represented one of the highest casualty rates per unit time of any engagement in the war's conventional phase. The Northumberland Fusiliers had been particularly hard hit, losing their commanding officer and suffering proportionate casualties that approached 20% of their strength engaged. Boer casualties were also substantial, estimated at around 150 killed and wounded, though exact figures were never established. This was significantly higher than Boer losses at Belmont, reflecting both the larger force engaged and the intensity of the close-quarters fighting. The Boers had proven again that they could inflict disproportionate casualties on attacking British forces. But Graspan showed they were not invulnerable, and that determined British assaults could reach and overwhelm their positions, at heavy but not prohibitive cost. The immediate aftermath of Graspan saw Methuen's column consolidating control of the captured positions while dealing with the human cost of the morning's fighting. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded, many suffering from multiple bullet wounds. The primitive medical capabilities of 1899 meant that many men who might have survived with modern treatment would die from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. Burial parties worked through the afternoon, interring the dead in mass graves marked by simple cairns of stones. The psychological impact of Graspan on British troops was profound and troubling. Belmont had been shocking, but Graspan was worse precisely because it came second. The soldiers now understood that Belmont had not been an aberration but a template for what every engagement would involve. The kopjes that dotted the landscape between their current position and Kimberley, each potentially another killing ground, stretched ahead like a gauntlet they would have to run. Morale, already shaken, deteriorated further as exhaustion and casualties mounted. For British officers, Graspan reinforced the tactical lessons of Belmont while adding new concerns. The intelligence failure that had underestimated Boer strength by a factor of 3 was disturbing, suggesting that they were fighting blind, advancing against positions whose strength they couldn't accurately assess until they were committed to attack. The effectiveness of Boer defensive positions was again proven, as was the limited utility of artillery bombardment against dispersed defenders. Most concerning was the casualty rate. At this pace, Methuen's force would be bled white before reaching Kimberley. Lord Methuen himself was forced to confront uncomfortable realities after Graspan. His column had now fought 2 battles in 3 days, suffering over 500 casualties combined, and had advanced barely 20 miles toward Kimberley. The besieged city was still over 60 miles away, and intelligence suggested multiple Boer defensive positions remained between his current location and his objective. Simple arithmetic suggested that continuing this approach would result in prohibitive casualties. But political pressure for Kimberley's relief remained intense, and Methuen had no alternative strategy available. The Boer perspective on Graspan was complex and somewhat contradictory. On one hand, they had again demonstrated their ability to inflict heavy casualties on British forces, and had made the British pay dearly for territorial gains. On the other hand, they had been forced to abandon another position, giving ground to British advances. The close quarters fighting had been costly in Boer casualties, and the realization that British troops could actually reach their positions and fight hand-to-hand was psychologically significant. The myth of Boer invulnerability in defensive positions, if it had ever existed, was complicated by Graspan's outcome. Koos de la Rey emerged from Graspan with his reputation enhanced despite the tactical withdrawal. He had concentrated substantial forces, prepared strong positions, and inflicted maximum casualties on the British advance. That he had chosen to withdraw rather than risk his force's destruction demonstrated sound tactical judgment. De la Rey understood that the Boer strategy had to be attrition rather than decisive battle, making the British pay heavily for every advance while preserving Boer fighting strength to contest the next position. The international reaction to news of Graspan was muted by the simultaneous reporting of multiple engagements across South Africa. The battle was overshadowed by events at Modder River just days later, and then by the disasters of Black Week in mid-December. But military professionals studying the early campaigns noted Graspan as evidence that the Boer War would be characterized by high casualties and slow advances, very different from the rapid colonial campaigns Britain had conducted elsewhere. The tactical lessons of Graspan were essentially the same as those of Belmont, but with additional emphasis on the importance of accurate intelligence and the dangers of underestimating enemy strength. British forces had attacked at Graspan with plans based on facing a third of the actual Boer strength present, a failure of intelligence that should have been catastrophic. That they succeeded anyway was due to numerical superiority and willingness to accept casualties, not to tactical excellence or sound planning. The close quarters fighting at Graspan also highlighted a peculiar aspect of Boer War combat, the coexistence of modern rifle warfare at long ranges with occasional descents into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Most of the war's fighting occurred at ranges of several hundred yards, with opponents who barely saw each other. But when British troops actually reached Boer positions, as at Graspan, the fighting became intensely personal and violent. This duality, swinging between impersonal long-range shooting and intimate close-range killing, was psychologically destabilizing for participants. For the individual soldiers who fought at Graspan, the battle represented an experience of sustained fear and violence that tested human endurance. The British troops, who advanced across open ground under fire, climbed rocky slopes while being shot at, and then fought hand-to-hand in Boer trenches, experienced combat at its most intense. Many developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. manifesting as nightmares, hypervigilance, and difficulty functioning after the battle. Victorian military culture had no framework for understanding or treating such conditions, which were often dismissed as cowardice or weakness. The Boer fighters at Graspan also carried psychological scars from the intensity of the combat. Men who had shot at distant targets from the safety of sungers suddenly found British soldiers in their trenches, fighting at arm's length. The experience of hand-to-hand combat, of killing and nearly being killed in close quarters, was profoundly traumatic, even for men accustomed to violence. The decision to withdraw, while tactically sound, also carried psychological weight. Abandoning positions they had prepared and defended felt like defeat, even when it was actually sound military practice. The medical aftermath of Graspan illustrated the primitive state of battlefield medicine in 1899. Wounded men were evacuated to field hospitals that were essentially large tents with basic surgical equipment. Anesthesia was available but limited. Antiseptic procedures were understood but imperfectly implemented. Many wounds that would be survivable with modern treatment proved fatal from infection, shock, or blood loss. The survival rate for serious wounds was perhaps 50%, meaning that many of the men carried off Graspan's slopes died not immediately but over the following days and weeks. The strategic significance of Graspan, like Belmont before it, lay not in the ground captured but in the casualties inflicted and the attrition of British combat power. Methuen's column was advancing toward Kimberley, but it was being ground down with each engagement. The troops were exhausted, morale was declining, and casualties were mounting. Most critically, the column was discovering that each Boer position would have to be taken by frontal assault at heavy cost. A realization that suggested the relief of Kimberley might be beyond their capacity to achieve. Graspan also marked the point where British confidence in quick victory began to collapse entirely. After Belmont, there had been hope that the Boers had been taught a lesson and would be more cautious in future engagements. After Graspan, it was clear that the Boers would contest every position with maximum force, and that the pattern of costly British advances would continue. The comfortable assumption that colonial warfare meant minimal British casualties and quick victory was being shattered by the reality of fighting a well-armed, skilled opponent on terrain that favored defense. The bloodiest hill fight at Graspan foreshadowed the even greater disasters that would strike British arms in the coming weeks. Methuen's column would continue its advance, fighting the Battle of Modder River on November 28th with similar results, a tactical victory purchased at heavy cost. Then, on December 11th at Magersfontein, just 16 days after Graspan, Methuen's exhausted force would walk into a devastating ambush that would destroy the Highland Brigade and become one of the iconic British defeats of the war. The pattern established at Belmont and reinforced at Graspan frontal assaults against prepared Boer positions resulting in heavy British casualties would reach its catastrophic culmination at Magersfontein. When we reflect on the Battle of Graspan more than a century later, we see it as a critical moment in the evolution of British understanding about the war they were fighting. Belmont had been a shock. Graspan was confirmation that the shock was the new reality. The 4 hours of savage fighting on November 25, 1899, cost nearly 200 British casualties and demonstrated that every copy between Methuen's column and Kimberley would extract a similar price. The hand-to-hand fighting in Boer trenches showed that even when British troops succeeded in reaching enemy positions, the cost was measured in blood and trauma. Graspan was the bloodiest hill fight of the early war, not just because of its casualty count, but because of its intensity. 4 hours of combat producing 200 casualties represented killing and wounding at a rate that exceeded most other engagements. The close-quarters nature of much of the fighting, with men shooting each other at point-blank range and fighting with bayonets and rifle butts, added a dimension of brutal intimacy that made the battle particularly horrific for participants. This was not the clean, distant warfare that modern weapons were supposed to have created, but a descent into savage violence that shocked both sides. The kopjes at Graspan, where British soldiers and Boer commandos killed each other in trenches and sungers, became another monument to the gap between military expectations and combat reality. The British had expected their numerical superiority and professional training to overcome Boer resistance with acceptable casualties. The Boers had expected their defensive positions and marksmanship to make British advances prohibitively costly. At Graspan, both sides discovered that modern warfare meant suffering that exceeded anyone's anticipations, casualties that shocked even hardened veterans, and fighting so intense that it left psychological scars as deep as physical wounds. The battle announced that the road to Kimberley would be paved with British casualties, that Lord Metheun's relief column was being ground down faster than reinforcements could rebuild it, and that the Boer War would not be won through conventional advances against prepared positions. These lessons, written in the blood of nearly 200 British soldiers in 4 hours of fighting, should have prompted a fundamental reassessment of British tactics and strategy. That such reassessment came slowly and incompletely, leading to even greater disasters in the weeks ahead, stands as an indictment of institutional inflexibility and the human cost of failing to learn from experience. The bloodiest hill fight at Graspan was simultaneously a British tactical victory and a strategic warning. The kopjes were captured, the Boers withdrew, and the march to Kimberley continued. But the cost of that victory, measured in casualties and exhaustion and eroding morale, suggested that the march might not reach its destination before the column destroyed itself through attrition. 2 battles in 3 days, 500 combined casualties, and another 60 miles to Kimberley through terrain dotted with kopjes that might each be another Graspan. The arithmetic was brutal and the conclusion inescapable. The relief of Kimberley would cost far more than anyone had anticipated, and the Boer War would be far longer and bloodier than the brief colonial campaign Britain had expected. All of this was written in 4 hours of savage fighting on rocky hills near a farm called Graspan, where 2 armies discovered that modern warfare meant suffering on a scale that shattered comfortable assumptions about military power and quick victory.